makes bar none is this person. Richard D. Wolff, economist, professor, Dr. Richard D. Wolff was the person who first yanked me from the false belief that we had an economic system that actually works for everybody. So without further ado, I want to bring you El Doctor Richard D. Wolff. Senor Wolff, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, Egberto, and thank you for such a rousing introduction. I hope I live up to this wonderful billing.
Well, I don't think anybody in my audience that have any kind of economic knowledge or a little bit of know-how, they know who you are. But for those who don't know, let me explain. Dr. Richard D. Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update, which Pacifica carries as well. His latest book, one of his latest books is The Sickness in System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That's available everywhere. But please go visit his website at www.democracyatwork.info, where you get a lot of information. Correct whatever I need to be corrected on before we get started, Doctor.
No, you've got it all right. Let's get into the material that we need to talk about.
Absolutely so, my friend. Absolutely so. Anyway, folks, look, right now I have been speaking about the Biden's economy doing much better than expected. In fact, I've been saying doing pretty well. Many expected it to go into recession. Many expected it to crash, etc. Well, it hasn't really in the aggregate done so. Before the show and speaking to Dr. Wolff here, I think he has a message not only for me to correct the narrative that I have been given, but I think he has a message for all of us that we need to take to task. So without further ado, what I'm going to say, Dr. Wolff, take it away.
Okay, Egberto, thank you very, very much. And I'm going to build on the fine work that you do, talking about economics, teaching about it, honestly, in ways people can get to understand what's going on, something which the mainstream media is terribly, terribly poor at doing. So let me begin by saying there's no question in my mind that Mr. Biden is better for the economic situation in this country than Mr. Trump could have been or was. And there are many ways in which that is shown. That's clear to me. However, the statement that we are in good shape as an economic system, that I believe is incorrect. And let me give you a few ways to understand that. A new statistic that I became aware of this morning shows that we currently have over 12% of the American households that are called in the modern language food insecure. We used to call that going hungry, but that frightens people. So we cleaned up our act and we talk about food insecurity. This is the same week that the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, who, by the way, was a classmate of mine at Yale University years ago in the same program in economics, in which she said that we can afford 2 wars. I was flabbergasted by such a remark, the insensitivity of it to what war means. We cannot afford it, not as moral human beings, not as people who care about one another. We cannot afford 2 wars. But put that aside, let's simply ask the question. The government this week asked for $106 additional billion to fight wars in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. At the same time that 1 out of 8 families in this country is going hungry. That's not a good economic story at all. Let me give you another example. The level of inequality in this country. Inequality in terms of the tiny number of people at the top who get enormous wealth and the mass of people who don't get anywhere near adequate housing, clothing, food. That inequality is greater than it has been in decades. We have worsened the inequality. Even during the pandemic, we made it worse than it had been before, and that continues. That's not a sign of a healthy economy, because before that even began, we had levels of inequality that violate any notion of a democratic society. We don't all start in the same place. We aren't on a level playing field. We are in a very unequal situation with people having very unequal chances to make a good life, to get a good job, to take care of their families, to realize their own potential. And the last way I would put it is the following. The American working class, the mass of our people, have been subjected over the last 30 years to a level of economic squashing them down that is making them act politically and in many other ways in frightening new ways. But it's not frightening if you understand what has happened. Number one, the growing inequality that makes all notions of fairness, of equal opportunity, fly right out the window. Number two, we had 3 economic crashes in the first 20 years of this century. The dot-com crash in 2000, the so-called Great Recession of 2008 and 9, and then the pandemic or COVID-19 crash in 2020-21. 3 times in which masses of workers, counted in the tens of millions, lost their jobs, used up their savings, suffered the stresses and difficulties of unemployment, a spectacular burden to open a century with. And before that was even done, we were hit by a pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for a century. And before that was done, we had an inflation among the worst in our modern history. And before that was done, we've had a shooting up of interest rates. It's too much. You have hit the American working class with one of these blows after another. And when you stack all of that up, then what Mr. Biden has done, however much better it might be or is than the Republicans, it really ends up being way too little and way too late.
I think that is a perfect explanation of it, and I think going forward, in effect, I think one of the reasons why I kept the narrative the way I kept the narrative is because of the how you started. Biden is better than Trump, but nowhere close to where we need to be economically.
Right.
And I think we need to be much more bold in making the statement that absolutely not, there's more to be done. You mentioned about inflation. Isn't it true that inflation is not really, technically speaking, a government thing, but simply the people with pricing power that says, I can charge you whatever I want to charge you, and in the process, steal your money legally?
Yeah, I am amazed. And I really want to congratulate you for your program in making it clear that inflation is not some mysterious business. It isn't so hard to understand, and it isn't the result of bad government behavior. And in order to make this point, let me be for a moment an economics professor, which is what I've done all my life. An inflation is simply when prices go up. They don't have to go up a lot. They don't all have to go up the same amount. It's just when, in general, prices are going up. And that's why we call the situation we're in right now an inflation. Prices are going up, and not just 1 or 2% a year, more than that, what makes it really clear, as we all know when we go to the supermarket or the department store, it's very obvious we're living in a time of inflation. Okay, now let's do real quickly. Number one, who is responsible for setting the prices in the store? Answer, the employers of this country. They're the ones who decide. If you make a toaster, what's the price you're going to attach to it? If you cook up a hamburger, what's the price you're going to... Look, there's no mystery here. 3% of the American people are employers. The other 97% are not. Prices are set by 3%, and the rest of us have to pay. There's no democracy here. We didn't vote for those 3%. We didn't choose them. We have no way of expressing our upset with them than to be other than unable to afford what it is we may need, our children may need, and all the rest of it. So if you want to know why there's an inflation, the only honest answer is that the employer class of this country, a very small minority, decided to raise prices. They could have decided to lower them. They could have decided to leave them as they are. But the power, the authority, the legal right to raise and lower a price is in the hands of employers. Next question. Why would employers raise prices? The answer is what every businessman or woman learns in business school. You raise prices if and when that can improve your profits. That's what business is in business to do. That's what General Motors, General Electric, General anything else is trying to figure out. If we raise prices, we may sell fewer goods. So then the question is, how much more do we gain by raising the price versus how many fewer sales we'll make? And they'll only raise the price if they can make a better profit doing so. So we've answered the question. Why do you have an inflation? Because businesses raise prices. And why do they do it? To make more money. So if you're not happy with an inflation, because it hurts you and your family. You can't afford what you had hoped to, whether it's an education for your child, whether it's the medical care you need for a sick relative, or anything else. It's a small group of people whose search for profit has put you in this situation. That's the crucial thing to understand. That's why it's a mistake to blame the government. But there should be no mystery why people do that, because that's real easy. Businesses aren't stupid. The people who run businesses know that if they raise the price in order to make more profit, which is what they're in business to do, it's going to upset the people who have to pay the higher prices. So what have the business community learned? When you raise prices to get more profits, always be ready to blame somebody else. So here we go, folks, because you know as well as I do who the blame characters are. It is, I don't know, China and Russia. Let's try that one. That doesn't work. Supply chains have been disrupted. That's the funniest one in the world. We have, the last 40 years, American companies have moved production to China and Brazil and India as far away as they can get. Why? Because it was profitable. One side effect, a long supply chain.
Yes.
And you know what you have? You have vulnerability. It can rain. There can be a war. There can be geopolitical problems. You have what's called a purchasing manager if you're a big company. You know what the job of the purchasing manager is? To anticipate supply chain disruptions and have a plan B and a plan C. If the purchasing manager came to the CEO and said, hey, there's a terrible problem, I can't get the raw materials I want, the CEO would look at that character and say, you know why we pay you a salary? Because you have to be able to get that problem solved. Don't come to me and tell me there is a problem. That's why we hired you, because those problems crop up all the time. Here's another one you can blame. The war, I don't know, in Ukraine, or maybe Mr. Putin, if that's enjoyable. Anybody else, and here comes the most developed one, the government. After all, we're all critical of Washington, or we're all critical of our governors. We're all critical of those politicians. Let's load them up with another responsibility. You caused the inflation. You would flunk a class in economics if you talk like that, because the teacher, if he's any good, would explain to you, no, no, no. The worst you can say to the government is they didn't prevent the private sector from raising your prices. That's what they didn't do. They went along. They pumped. Now here comes the one that fools a lot of people. Did the government pump in more money over recent years? Yes. And you know why? It's because if the businesses raise the prices, then unless the government pumps in more money, there won't be enough money to buy the higher priced goods. So what the government does is accommodate the inflation that begins with the private capitalist by pumping in the money that is needed to enable those goods to be sold. Don't be fooled. The reason you and many of the others like you and me believe that something other than the capitalist is raising the prices, that's because it's good for the capitalists. They want to be able to raise the price, earn more profit, and shift the blame for doing that onto somebody else. You're a sucker if you believe it. You've been had. It's like believing that if you use a particular kind of soap rather than another brand, your sex life will get much, much better. You know that's a joke. And we all laugh at it. Don't be fooled. Businesses raise prices. We have an inflation because it's profitable. And if it isn't profitable, they'll stop doing it. A reminder, for the first 20 years of this century, 2000 to 2020, the government in most of those years increased the supply of money, but we didn't have an inflation. There's no necessity at all for that link. That is a hustle designed to distract us from where the responsibility for inflation really lies.
You know, interestingly, today on my KPFT show here in Houston, I pointed out that our capitalist structure is one of the most undemocratic forms of economic system because, again, anytime you start talking about supply side type economics, it means that the supplier decides what you are going to want and you hope for trickle down. If you start at the lower level, the people would vote with the income that they have, what it is that they want for suppliers, that 3% that you talk about to produce. It's so hard, Dr. Wolff, to get people to empower themselves. To accept that they're already empowered, actually, to really demand what these 3% want. One of the reasons I wanted you on is you speak a lot about that. The first time I saw you was on when you came out with the thing with the conference called Capitalism Hits the Fan. That is where I got my economic acumen, if you will, when we realized the machinations that the corporate structure does to fool the American people and the Western people, if you want to take it to a global scale, into doing things against your own interests. Capitalism is supposed to be the efficient allocation of resources. Interestingly, I want to ask you a specific question. One of the most inefficient forms of providing anything to Americans is our healthcare system. And it is based 100% on some capitalist structure. How does that play? How can we continue to play that game? How can we continue to do this without eventually bankrupting the country?
Well, let me answer by starting with a compliment that I believe you deserve. You're putting forward ideas, thoughts, inviting people who are not normally on the mainstream media so that the American people can get another perspective. I don't blame Americans because they live in a society that constantly feeds them silly, disrespectful ways of thinking about the world, because they're afraid that if people understood, they'd be angry. And I think they're right. If people understood, they would be angry. That's part of the reason I just talked about the inflation. Understand who's doing that to you. At least then you can begin to think in an intelligent way, what can we do to make this situation better? But if you keep believing that the fault is in Mr. Putin or the fault is in Washington, you're not going to figure out how to solve the problem because you haven't yet been able to think through with the raw materials you need. And you provide those raw materials. And that's why I'm proud to be here. And now let me answer your question. We have to begin with facts that are indisputable. Number one, Americans spend more for everything having to do with healthcare than any other population of a developed industrial country. So we spend more. Roughly 18, 19% of our total economy is going into four industries: hospitals, doctors, drug and device makers, and health insurance companies. Those four. Together, they are the healthcare, you might call them the medical industrial complex. Might be a name for them. Okay. We put more money in their hands than Germans put in their medical industrial complex, or the British do, or the Japanese do, and I could go on for many, many countries. Second fact, the the medical results, the quality of the healthcare in the United States is stunningly mediocre. We have a lower life expectancy than many other countries. You know, people in Cuba, just to pick an interesting example, live several years longer than we do. That's a poor country. We are a rich country, one of the richest in the world. And this enormous medical complex that we pour money into gave us a poorer result in the pandemic than many, many other countries who have fewer resources. In other words, it's not how much money we're putting in, it's how much benefit we're getting out of it, or rather, to be honest, not getting out of it. So what's going on? Well, the answer is obvious. Think with me, folks. If we get a mediocre result, and we're paying more than anybody else, including all the people who get better results, you would understand something is really wrong here. And there is. And the answer is obvious, because there's one thing you realize when you look at every major European country and many, many other countries in other parts of the world who have a better record. They have better health results and they spend less for them. You know what they have? A national health insurance program. They vary, they're not all the same, but they all say the following. I'm going to give you an example from my personal life. I was a visiting professor at the University of Paris in France. And when you do that and you work in another country like that, you have to go through, procedures and get the right to be a teacher, because I was paid a salary and all of that. And that automatically put me on their, get ready, national health system. So I got bronchitis, I got a couple of other little things, and I was introduced to their health system. I was given a little card when I started teaching. Whenever I had a medical problem, I took my card to a nearby clinic. They're all over the place. And I handed my card in, and on my card was everything about my body, my health history, and all the rest of it. A doctor came out, took the card, stuck it in a computer. There was my whole history. I explained what was wrong. They did an investigation. They did a diagnosis, sent me a couple of doors away to a lab where they took blood and all the rest of the stuff that they do. And I said, then, where do I pay? He smiled. He said, you don't pay. You don't pay. That's part of the way we run this country. And he said, explain to me, if you ever get sick, if you ever get injured, take the card. That's all you need. They'll put it in the machine, and that's it. I get paid a salary, he said. I'm a salaried employee of the government. I'm happy with my salary. I'd like a little more, but I know my job. I know that I can go home to my family at 6 o'clock and other doctors will be on duty. And that I couldn't get over it. There's no army of men and women that are clerks. There are no clerks. There's no army of people working for an insurance company, nickel and diming whether they will cover this or not, whether they'll give you all of it or not. None of that. They don't need to waste tons of money on work that doesn't need to be done. Because if someone is sick or injured, what they need is a doctor or a nurse to take care of them. That is not worked out. And guess what? France spends half of what we do. Now the last little point, but it's secondary, but it's important. In our country, an employer, in addition to the wages paid to a worker, is often under pressure to provide medical care. But because medical care is so expensive, this means a huge extra cost for our employers who have to compete with employers in other countries who don't have that expense because they have a much cheaper and much better functioning healthcare system. And in case you're wondering, French people live longer than Americans. Their average stay in the hospital is shorter than Americans, and on and on and on. The irony is that the only beneficiary of the healthcare system we have is the monopoly operated by the hospital, doctors, medical drug and device makers, and insurers who get together and work it all out. Look, that's what capitalism does. It drives the individual capitalist to grow, because otherwise you may be competed out of existence. And if you can cut a deal with others like yourself, you can become a monopoly and jack the price up even more. That's what the medical industry has done in this country. And if we continue to pretend otherwise, we're not going to solve the problem. Every other country, like the United States, has gone for a comprehensive national healthcare service. Private, public, mixtures of them. That can all be done. We have 50 models to choose from how to do it here. We even have right next door in Canada a single-payer health system. We have one in Mexico. On and on and on. There is no excuse. There never was. We are all drawn in to protecting a monopoly, even though the law in the United States, the Sherman Antitrust Act from 1890, the Clayton Act in 1914, that make monopolies illegal. We ought to break up the medical care one. It would be better for all Americans.
I think it's important for me to repeat what I said earlier because you prove it over and over again. Capitalism, while it is sold as being the efficient allocation of resources, everything that is happening in America, that likely the most capitalist Western country on the planet, proves that is one of the biggest snow jobs, the biggest fallacies. Right. Would you concur on that?
Absolutely. And, let me bring a little history into it, because everybody kind of knows this, but they don't put it together. Every economic system that the world has ever known, the human race, whether it's a small village economy, whether it's an extended family tribal economy, whether it's a slave economic system, whether it's feudalism, has been born, usually out of the decay of another one. It develops over time, and then it passes away. 4.5 centuries ago, modern capitalism was born. Over the last 4 centuries, it has developed. You all know where I'm going with this. It has to pass too. The question isn't whether. The question is only when. And I have news for you. Even though I know this is difficult, and I'm an American. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. It's as American as you can get. Lived and worked here all my life. The American empire is declining. There's no way out of that. The American capitalist system isn't the biggest, most powerful, most rapidly growing. It was for quite a while, for most of the years since the end of the Second World War, but it isn't anymore. One statistic, and then you'll see the point. There are now, as you all, I assume, know, there are now two great economic blocks in the world.
Yes.
One of them is the United States and its allies, usually referred to as the G7, the group of seven. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, Canada, and Japan. That's it. Those seven. They together now, if you add up all the goods and services they all produce, the GDPs of all seven, works out to about 29% of the total output of goods and services in the world today. The other block is China, People's Republic of China, and its allies. They are now known as the BRICS, BRICS, which stand for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they recently added 6 more countries. So it's now China and its 10 allies. If you add up the total output of goods and services of the BRICS, it's 33% of the world's output. 33% in the China alliance, 29% in the United States. It's over. If you're honest, you will understand that the world has changed as it always has, that those who are on top aren't anymore. New group is coming. And the real question is, will we work out a live and let live arrangement so we can all share this planet? Or are we going to be really stupid and destroy everything because we can't work out an arrangement that accommodates the changes that are already the reality we live in?
You know, from the chat, Kat Linden says, can you address the idea that we, the people, control what is made because we vote with our money or our feet? Before you answer that, though, Dr. Wolff, I want to mention that we sort of talked about that before, Kat. And we have to assume that somehow the money gets to the people first. But Dr. Wolff, please address that.
Yes, partly that is absolutely correct. We have some influence by the money we spend and where we spend it and how we spend it. But it's only a small part of the story. The decision, let me give you an example. You go to the store and you want to buy breakfast cereal for your children, that they have a proper breakfast in the morning. So you can control whether or not you buy the cereal. But what goes into that cereal? The chemicals, the grains, everything about that is shaped by somebody else, the company, the enterprise. And here's the real problem. For you as the buyer, for you and me, we only want to consume something that is nutritious and healthy for our family. What we would want, what we deserve, is that whoever produces is likewise interested in producing something that is healthy and in other words, meeting our demand. And I'm an economist. I've been teaching always supply and demand. The company supplies, the people demand. But here's the problem. You are interested in feeding and health and nutrition for your family. That's not the top priority for the enterprise. That's not how capitalism works. The top thing for the enterprise is how profitable it can be. How much money is it going to throw in to the process of producing that box of cereal? How profitable? How much profit can it get? That's its number one goal. If it's profitable, it will succeed, it will grow. If it isn't, it'll disappear. And that means the incentive of the supplier is different from the incentive of the buyer. That's why we have so many agencies of the government, like the Food and Drug Administration, because what they put in the cereal, if you let them, is what's profitable, not what's nutritious. What's profitable, not what's healthy. What's profitable, and will get your children to say, I want that brand. I want all of that. That's why this is a system that isn't working anymore, because profit is not what we, the people, need. What we need are businesses whose first and foremost job is to meet the demands of the people. That's what democracy requires, and that's what logic requires. Putting the profit between us and what we need, that's good for them. That's not good for us.
You know, Dr. Wolff, that is such an important concept. The cereal box, that's going to be added to my repertoire. That cereal comparison is the best and one that somebody can understand. The demand is for cereal that makes you healthy, but for what he believes that he wants to give you is what makes it more profitable for him. I love that one. You know, I wrote a book called As I See It, Class Warfare, the Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom. And in there, I spoke about the food supply and patents. And we didn't talk about discussing this, but I want to hit you up on this one because as you know, right now, what a lot of the ADMs and other corporations are doing is they're putting switches on seeds. In other words, whereas now, as opposed to a farmer being able to hold on to his own seeds, he has to buy the seeds every planting cycle because the seed is now not only copyrighted, but patented. And in so doing, we have corporations who ultimately control the food supply. What's your thoughts on that?
For me, it's exactly what I just said about the cereals. They are doing, the seed companies, what's profitable for them to do. They hire economists like me and food scientists and a whole army of professionals to give them advice on how to make what they do more profitable. Can they force people to buy their seed? That's what they will do. Look, every company ever in capitalism has tried to grow because growth is how you survive. Well, you can't all grow because if they all grow and they all produce more, we don't have the capacity to buy. So in the process of growth, some of them are more efficient than others in growing for whatever reasons. Good luck, clever management, could be a variety of things. And they are able, because they grew faster, to afford, for example, a new sexy machine that a smaller company cannot afford right now. And they get that, the one company gets the machine, is more efficient, lowers the price. We all buy that one because the price is lower, and the other company goes out of business. Long story short, what competition means is that some companies win and others lose. And if you understand economics, the winners buy the losers. The winners hire the workers laid off by the losers. And that's how many become few. The auto industry in this country began with dozens and dozens of automobile companies, and then we were left with GM, Ford, and Chrysler, right? And we see that in every industry, almost every one. Many become few. And as they become fewer, they are bigger and more profitable. And now they can use their money in a way that a little competitive company couldn't. They can do a lot of advertising, making us believe that this toothpaste is really different from that one, that this automobile is very different from that one. We know most of it's nonsense, but we live in a society that bombards us with it all the time. This is good for them because if we think their product is better than others, we'll buy more of them. So the company with the biggest ad budget becomes successful. Does it make a better product? Of course not. There's no reason to assume that. economics, they like to tell you that story because they keep wanting you to believe a simple make-believe. Here it goes. The make-believe works like this. What's profitable is profitable because it's the best thing. And I'm here to tell you, as a lifetime economist, there's no connection between what's most profitable and what's the best thing for you. That's why we have every industry in America is regulated. The businesses hate that. The Republican Party wants no regulation because the businesses they rely on don't want it. But why do we have regulation? Because every one of those industries has been caught ripping us off. You know, for decades, we produced cigarettes in this company. We now know from all the trials that they knew it was addictive. They knew it was hooked up to lung cancer, but they did it anyway. Are they bad people? No, I don't hate them. They're doing what this system taught them to do.
Exactly.
It was profitable. It was profitable to make cigarettes. Look, recently, ExxonMobil was exposed for having known for a long time that fossil fuels are not good for the climate. It's not new for them, but that's their business. They're busy expanding now in order to make a cash off of what? High prices. High prices, why? Because of the war in Ukraine? No, because they're raising the prices to take advantage of it. Don't be fooled. What's profitable is profitable. I understand that. But to assume that what's profitable is automatically going to guarantee the best that we can get, that's being a patsy for the employer class. They want you to believe that their pursuit of profit is the best outcome you can have or we can have. And that's never been true.
You know, it's interesting, Dr. Wolff. We have one of the people in our chat room. We have a whole lot of different ideologies in our chat room that completely got snowed by Larry Summers, who said, well, if we pump all this money into the economy, it's going to create inflation. He doesn't realize that what Larry Summers was doing was giving corporations the excuse to raise prices, as opposed to that. In other words, he was wrong on causation. Why don't you explain that to him? Because you probably do a better job than I do.
Yeah, he misunderstood the effect for the cause. It's a very old problem, but he's not an innocent person. He knows very well what he's doing. Comes out of the same educational environment that I do. We all learned pretty much the same thing at the same books from the same professors. Once again, inflation, pumping money into the economy, was done throughout the first 20 years of this century, from 2000 to 2020. The government pumped in record amounts of money into the economy. We had no inflation. Everybody who didn't like this said, we're going to have one, we're going to have one. And you know, if you're a broken clock twice a day, you're exactly on the right time. But you're still a broken clock because you only got it twice, and there's 24 hours in that day. And you were wrong all but twice in two moments. Okay, what's the problem? The government is called upon by business when the economy is in trouble. That's your first clue. The business leaders love to tell you the government's not efficient, the government's the problem, the government. You don't have to be a libertarian, although they go even further than most folks on this stuff. It's the government. And when there's all these different businesses and they all agree that the government is the problem, your suspicion, your little red flag in the back of your head ought to go up. Something smells. So let me explain to you that you're right. Something does smell. These businesses need a scapegoat. They need a fog. You know how people are. If things are difficult for you, you can be tempted to go blame somebody. And, you know, you have to learn to live with other people without doing that. That's easy for some of us, harder for others of us. The business community has no hesitation in blaming the government. Here's the irony. Whenever the business system falls apart, you know where all the business leaders go to get bailed out? To the very government they denounce on Monday, they're begging on Friday. And they get it because they control that government. Remember in the great crash of 2008 and 9, all the business leaders from Detroit, the car companies, they all got on their private jets and flew to Washington to appear before Congress to explain why the people's money held by the government should be given to them in the tens of billions of dollars, which they got. We bailed them out. Wow. If the government is such a mess and so inefficient, how come you have to turn to it every time you make a mess of the economic system? Look at it now. We turn to the Federal Reserve. That's a governmental operation to raise interest rates to deal with what? The problem of inflation, because the business community has been raising prices to the point where it threatens the economy. Notice, the business community messed up and the government is called in to fix it. Then to be told that the government is the problem, it's really outrageous. The government came in and pumped in money because otherwise there would have been no way to buy the higher priced goods. The government coming in was the effect, not the cause. The inflation was the cause, not the effect. You have to sort that out. Otherwise, it'll be confusing for you for the rest of your life.
And it's interesting because even as the government uses interest rates to try to mitigate inflation, to try to create lower demand, supposedly to drop inflation, the reality is they, on either side of the equation, they're asking the working class to pay the bill. They either pay the bill to the banker or they pay the bill to the higher prices to the corporations by buying the product. We pay the bill. We're down to our last 5 minutes or so, Dr. Wolff. It's amazing because anytime you come here, you come for a 30-minute session, but we end up taking the entire program because you're so filled up with information. So for that, I think the audience is happy for. I want to jump on the subject of our wars and where we're going. When I say wars, I'm even talking the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Ukraine issue, and all these other things. Where do we go from here? The average American citizen doesn't seem like they feel they can do anything about it. What the hell are we doing?
Well, I think, again, here, it's a lot of terrible misbehavior. I'm trying to be polite by the mainstream media in not giving it an honest range of opinion. That's what we need. We need to hear critical voices. We need to hear celebratory voices. We don't need to be spoon-fed by being given what some company or some government official thinks is the way we ought to believe. And Americans are usually pretty good about that, but they need to be, how shall I say, encouraged to be a bit more like their best self. And here's the example. The Middle East. Israel is a new country, relatively speaking, only formed after World War II. And as you know, there has been wars and conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and their Arab neighbors, pretty much continually ever since. Yeah, sometimes it was a hot war, sometimes it was a cold war, sometimes it looked like maybe we could solve it, but we haven't. And the proof of it is the horrible things that have happened in the last 2 to 3 weeks. Horrible on both sides, as they have been horrible on both sides many times. But the reality is that you cannot escape is that the efforts by the United States, by its allies over the years, by the United Nations, and so on, have not succeeded in resolving this dispute. Because what's going on now is, if anything, even more horrible than the last 75 years. I think that's honest, and we have to face it. If the United States meant it when it said over the years that it was committed to peace in the Middle East, then that project has to be called what it is: a failure. It didn't work. Now, the United States is not alone responsible for that failure. The Palestinians have a share of the blame. The Israelis have a share of the blame, as does the United States, because we were the global power. We were the ones who had the resources. We were the ones with the global prestige. We took it on ourselves. We had meetings at Camp David, even though those countries are far away. We did that. No other country did that. We did it, and it didn't work. So something has to happen different from what happened before. Otherwise, we are doing something which is very strange, keeping up with the same stuff, even though we have learned over many years that it does not work. Okay, that's the first thing. And second thing, we are no longer the power we once were. We need other parts of the world, large, rich, powerful countries. And the number one is the People's Republic of China. Not because we agree with them, not because they are better than us, not at all, but because they are part of the world as it now exists, and they're a very big and very rich and very powerful part of the world, and we're not going to solve a global problem without them. And we have already failed to do it without them. So, clue, let's try it with them and bring them in. Number two, the one thing almost everyone can agree, really, is that killing large numbers of people is not an acceptable way to solve problems in the world. You know, if you really believe in an eye for an eye, then I want to remind you of what a very smart comedian once said. If you use the system of an eye for an eye, you make the whole world blind. It's not effective. It's not an effective mechanism. Hamas killed innocent people. The Israelis killed innocent people. That has to stop. So if you want to know my own opinion, it's just mine. The first thing we need is a ceasefire. Stop it. Stop the bombing. Stop the attacks. Stop it. And now have the rest of the world say to the Hamas and the Palestinians on one side, and Netanyahu and the Israelis on the other, stop this. And we will have a conference. We know it's difficult. It may not go quickly, but we are not going to permit people killing each other on TV every night as a way to solve the problem. And to be very honest, as an American, I look at the world now and I say, there's a problem in Ukraine, and my country is pumping military weapons there. I don't think that's going to be a good solution to the problem. And I don't think it's going to be a good solution to give weapons either to Hamas or to the Israelis now either, because that fuels a fire we would rather put out. So I'm opposed to doing those things. And I'm a little bit unhappy that my government seems to think that throwing guns and killing is a way to solve problems. I don't think it'll work. I don't think it worked in Korea. I don't think it worked in Afghanistan. I don't think it worked in Iraq. I don't think it works. It produces worse problems than what we set out to solve. That's my view, but I think it's urgent that we get into the habit of finding other ways to solve our problems, or else we're going to have a really tough century. The 20th century had 2 world wars and didn't have nuclear weapons. Do we really want to go in the direction of wars? Do we want a Secretary of the Treasury to say in the face of all of this, hey, we can afford 2 wars at the same time?
Dr. Wolff, I tell you what, last always give me a closer, whatever you want to say.
I appreciate your inviting me. If people find any of this interesting, please visit our website, Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info. I'm particularly pleased to be on your program because you and I share many, many, many things, and I have learned from you, and I see the effect you have on other people, including my own students in my classes, and I'm very grateful that you're doing the good work that you do.
Dr. Wolff, thank you so kindly for having been a part of Politics Done Right. Believe me, I have learned. I started with you with Capitalism Hits the Fan. That brought me the beginning of learning the economic knowledge that I have today. So thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel. And number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join. Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Today, we are honored once again to speak to the one and only Thom Hartmann, the progressive radio host. I call it progressive radio host extraordinaire. Thom Hartmann is a four-time winner of the Project Censored Award, a New York Times bestselling author of more than 33 books. How much is it up to right now?
I don't know.
All right. I just wanted to break in with that. Anyway, he's America's #1 progressive talk show host. His show is syndicated on local for-profit and non-profit stations and broadcast nationwide and worldwide, including at our station here, KPFT 90.1 FM Houston. It is also simulcast on Holmes, www.hiddenhistorybooks.com. Anyway, today we are here to discuss quite a bit, but Thom, welcome to Politics Done Right again.
Hey, Egberto, it's great to be back with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, let me tell you, what we are here to discuss. Again, another one of your impressive books. I've not been able to read it word for word, but just the table of contents and otherwise tells us that it's yet another misread. It covers a lot of things, folks, that we've covered right through this entire program with regards to our democracy, and it's called The Hidden History of American Democracy, in which Thom covered quite a bit. That it is apropos in these times, especially with what we hope, Donald Trump, the American traitor, hopefully going to jail. Anyhow, Senor, how are you doing today? Why did you write this book? And I know it's a silly question, but our audience wants to know.
No, it's a great question. I wrote the book because there are so many misconceptions, many of which are being promoted or exploited by right-wingers about the foundation of this country. Right-wingers saying we're a Christian nation. We're not. That the founders wanted it to be a Christian nation. They didn't. That democracy is an abnormal thing, they say, and it's just an idea somebody came up with. And really, we can kind of set it aside and just make Donald Trump emperor and everything will be fine. That's more normal, 1,000 years of history in Europe. That's not true. Democracy is actually our default state. The theory that the Constitution was written exclusively for rich white men to protect their wealth, an idea that rich white men love to promote, but it's not true. There's a bunch of myths that bubbles that I wanted to burst, as it were, myths that I wanted to pop with this book, and I think I hope I've done a good job of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went through it and it was like, wow, he touches on everything. First of all, let me tell you, the David Cobb, a friend of mine, I think a friend of just about everybody in the progressive space, and who ran once for president of the United States. Once we had a long night discussion. He said the Constitution is nothing more than a capital document. I want to start there. Is that something that you could agree with?
Well, if you define capital as private property, yeah, the Constitution does acknowledge, private property and protect it in some ways. But back in the 1920s, in 1929, actually, Charles Beard and Mary Beard, his wife, they were professors of history at Columbia University. He was a Marxist, he was a socialist. She was a Marxist. And they published what was probably the best-selling American history during that period from the 1930s to the 1950s, called, The History of the United States, from a Marxist economic analysis point of view. Beard also wrote a book called An Economic Analysis of the Constitution, making that argument. And in 1956, Forrest McDonald, a historian and scholar, decided that he would see, was there any truth to this? Going back to, what was the intent of the people who wrote it? Who were the people who wrote it? And what was the intent of the people who ratified the Constitution? And what he found was that, first off, the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, there were a number of people who owned a lot of land. Jefferson and Washington, for example, but land was cheap then. You just stole it from the Indians. And it really wasn't a measure of wealth. In fact, in many ways, it was a kind of a ball and chain. You had to work the land, and there were obligations, and in some cases, even taxes. Jefferson died in bankruptcy. George Washington could not afford to free the slaves that he had promised to free on his death. His estate was gone within a generation. James Madison, his family could only hold on to his estate for about a couple of decades after his death. None of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence left any multi-generational wealth of consequence, and none of them left multi-generational wealth that lasted more than 2 generations. There were no Rockefellers, there were no DuPonts or Morgans or like that among the founders. There were people of that kind of wealth during the founding generation. The Johnson family up on the Hudson River had a massive castle with 300 European retainers who wore knights' suits of armor and things. There were some just obscenely rich people in the United States. Virtually all of them got their wealth from their connections to either the British royal family or the East India Company. And all of them pretty much left the country during the Revolutionary War. The Johnson family fled to Canada, for example. So the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock, and his wealth in today's dollars was around $700,000. He was, so first off, what we're talking about is the upper middle class, not the morbidly rich of the era. That was the Declaration. You look at the Constitution. The people who helped write the Constitution, there were no genuinely rich people among that crowd. There were a lot of lawyers. There were a lot of school teachers. Politicians. They were not particularly wealthy. James Madison promised everybody that he would keep their deliberations secret for 50 years until everyone had died, and he kept that promise. They weren't published until after his death, 50 years later. He was very young at the time. He was in his late 20s, early 30s. And the reason why, it turns out, is because they were betraying their class. They were betraying or in their opinions, they were betraying the wealthy people. So McDonald then went and looked at the...
Let's get to stop a second, Thom, because you just enlightened me with something that I didn't know. Because there were many times that I said some stark things about the founding fathers, but you're telling me that in as much as many of the founding fathers were really benevolent guys willing to go against their elitist class. Is that what did I understand that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure benevolent is, it might be a little too gushy, but yeah, they believed in democracy. They believed in this experiment. They practiced it in a very imperfect fashion, and they came from a rather bizarre time and that they were born into. And, I'm not here to justify, for example, slavery, which was the major sin of the era. But yes, and they were not the morbidly rich, and they weren't trying to create a country of, by, and for the morbidly rich. So then McDonald went and looked at the 13 ratifying conventions. Who showed up to ratify the Constitution in each one of these states in 1789. And what he found again was that the genuinely rich people in each one of the states opposed the Constitution. Patrick Henry is a great example. He was the richest man in Virginia. He was the largest slaveholder in Virginia. He held over 360 people in bondage. And he opposed the Constitution. At the ratifying convention, he stood up and spoke against it. In fact, James Madison modified the Second Amendment. Just, I think you and I have talked about this when my book on guns came out,
right.
Just to satisfy Patrick Henry's paranoia that a president might call up the Virginia militia, which was also their slave patrol, and thus, break the hold of slavery in the state. He changed the word nation to the word state in the Second Amendment. So, yeah, that would. Oh, and what Forrest McDonald found was that in every single one of the 13 states, and I've got the information in my book, but you can also read his book. It was published in 1956. It's not in print any longer, but you can find used copies fairly easily. He found that in state after state, the people who were in favor of the Constitution were the people who were in debt, teachers, lawyers, which was not a well-paid profession in most cases. Small subsistence farmers, and the people who opposed the Constitution were the genuinely wealthy people, particularly the industrialist class, which was just beginning to emerge, and people who had long associations with the British royal family and the East India Company. So, that's the history. I mean, you can look it up. It's bizarre how it gets danced around. I mean, I think I might have mentioned on Wikipedia, it says, George Washington's estate was worth $1 billion. He was a rich man in his time. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. I mean, he couldn't afford to free his own slaves. Land was cheap. So good.
It is important for us to know that, because, like I said, you come to the wrong conclusions about our democracy, and these folks that are running around with Trump right now. It's amazing how wrong they have it, from us being founded on the Christian nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have a chapter in the book called "Did Rich White Guys Create the United States Just to Guarantee Their Own Privilege, Power, and Slaves?" Yeah,
that's what you and I were just talking about. That
right.
So
I think in effect, you and again, that is something that I think many progressives themselves would be out there. Not only conservatives would deny that, but progressives were out there talking a whole lot about that. Now, in this particular group of chapters, you talk about the way the country was structured democratically. Your thoughts on that? Because in all the studying that I've done and the reading of the Constitution, I find it a very flawed document personally. I'm no scholar, but I find it a very flawed document that I think all the compromises that were made actually made it not a democracy. Your thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, keep in mind, they were trying something that had never before been done. The Roman Republic bore very little resemblance to us. I mean, they had an institution called the Senate. That's about it. The Greek democracy was organized in a completely different fashion. I mean, you had basically jury duty. Everybody had to serve for a year, 6,001 people to create a consensus, or to create I forget the name of the body, the right. Greek body. So this was a brand new experiment, and it was based largely on the Iroquois Confederacy, frankly, and I document that in some detail in the book. And they were trying to adapt that to a society that was not Iroquois, that was not a hunting gathering society or a marginally agricultural society. And there were a lot of compromises, admittedly. But, the point of democracy, I think the biggest point about democracy that I make in the book, and the biggest myth about democracy, particularly that gets promoted by conservatives, is that democracy is this weird thing that some smart people came up with, but it's not normal for humans. What's normal is the way Europe was for 1,000 years, where you got a king and you got the barons and then you got all the serfs, and that's what's normal. And that's really, what, if left to our own devices, we would recreate, because that's normal for humanity. And it turns out that's complete BS. And not just for humans, by the way. Back about a decade and a half ago, two British scientists, Roper and Conrad, proposed in an article in Nature that we would find that this mythology of the alpha animal in nature, that there's an alpha wolf and an alpha deer and an alpha elk, and that the alpha animal rules the herd, that would be completely false. That what we would find was that the alpha animal would have first selection of sexual partner, of mates, which comports with natural selection to pass along the strongest genes, but that would be it. They would not be the decision makers. And James Randerson and a group of scientists put this to the test with a herd of red deer in the forest that was owned by a university at Essex in the UK, putting cameras in the trees and asking the question, when do the deer decide to go to which one of the 3 watering holes in this forest, and how do they make that decision? And it turned out that the deer would be grazing, and they would start pointing their bodies at one of the 3 watering holes, different deer. And when 51% of them were pointing at one of the water holes, the entire herd would kind of form and head to that watering hole. Democracy.
Wow.
So, in our Constitution, not only is it 50% plus 1 to pass laws and things like that, but for really difficult things like amending the Constitution, dangerous things, we require a supermajority. So what Ray Anderson and his scientists did was they staked a predator near each one of the 3 watering holes and said, okay, now let's see what the deer do, And then what it took was 66% of the deer pointing at a particular watering hole to head to that watering hole. So that supermajority exists in nature as well. So I called up Ken Conrad and I said, what happened when you published this in Nature? And he was like, I got all this feedback. This bug guy called me up and said, with gnats, ball of gnats in the air, like in the summer, and you see this ball of gnats and then it goes zoop, like that. And how do they know when to move, right? Are they telepathic? No. With every wing beat, every gnat is voting. I'm going to move a little more to the left. And when 51% of them move a little more to the left, the whole ball moves to the left. He heard from a fish guy, and a ichthyologist. Yeah, this accounts for schooling behavior. Again, I always thought fish must be telepathic because there's not a lead fish going, hey, let's go to the right. I mean, at least with geese, they're honking at each other. You think maybe they're talking.
Right.
But, not fish. Well, it turns out they're not telepathic. Every motion is a vote. The same with birds flying and flocking. You'll see a flock of crows going across the sky, and suddenly it just goes like that. Well, how do they know to do that? Well, they're literally voting with every wing beat. And the conclusion that they came to in this study that ultimately was also published in Nature was that democracy is the default mode in all animals. I mean, from ants to primates. And the founders were particularly fond of this idea. They actually believed this to be the case, so much so that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote, he was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said this was the goal of nature's God. He talks about nature's God in the Declaration.
Right.
And he hands this off to John Adams to edit. And John Adams, of course, was a Christian. John Adams scratches out nature's God and puts in the Christian God, right? And Jefferson gets it back and scratches out the Christian God and writes nature's God. And it's still there in the Declaration of Independence, nature's God. They believed that the natural state was small d democratic. And the goal was to have as much democracy as possible, which is why the first among equals, and they're not really equals, but the first among the 3 branches of the government, the first among the 4 parts of the 3 branches of the government was the House of Representatives, because it's the closest to people. The Senate then came out of a compromise, the big state, small state compromise. The presidency, the Electoral College, we can talk about that if you want. It's in the book, Why the Electoral College. But that was designed to try to avoid a president who was a scam artist, a hustler, a drunk, a person of low moral character, to quote Alexander Hamilton.
And but it turned out the opposite is what occurred, right?
Yeah, sadly. And then the Electoral College became an anachronism within 50 years of its creation because of the telegraph. And because of the Pony Express and things. But when they wrote the Constitution, the problem was, not only was there no telegraph, Ben Franklin was flying kites in thunderstorms. They didn't even have electricity. It was Leyden jar, and that was it. And so it could take 2, 3, and we didn't have a really comprehensive postal system at all. And so it could take 2, 3 weeks. It could take a month for a letter to make it from Georgia to Washington, D.C.
Right.
So how would a voter in Georgia know who to vote for president? There were no national newspapers. There was no telegraph. There's no radio or television. So what they came up with was that the Georgians would not vote for president. They would vote for people who were pledged to particular candidates for president, but they were actually voting for these electors. And the electors would then go physically to Washington, D.C., where on December 15th, they would cast their votes. And physically being in D.C., they would interview the candidates. And if they concluded that the people of Georgia had voted for a guy who was really a scoundrel, they wouldn't cast their vote for him, which is why you have, faithless electors. They literally wrote that in the Constitution. I mean, it was a great kind of safety valve protection system against a Donald Trump kind of person. But like I said, by the time the Pony Express and the telegraph came along, in the 1830s and 1840s, it was completely anachronistic. It was completely out of date. And we should have gotten rid of it 150 years ago. We almost did, by the way. We came within one vote in the Senate of getting rid of the Electoral College in the 1970s. In the 1970s. I think it was 74.
Okay.
I didn't have to go back and look.
It needs to go because, in as much as they did it for good purposes, in my opinion, again, it was never a real fail-safe, fail-safe. And look at what we've had. Every time that it misfired, it misfired for a particular kind of person. It's amazing.
George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Bush lost by half
same kind of vote, right? 3 minutes.
Yeah. So it's time to get rid of the Electoral College.
But I'm glad to hear that Nate. I speak a lot about most people being good, and in as much as most people being good, we just have these charlatanes out here that like Donald Trump and others. But my question then about democracy, and I want to go into something great about your book, is that a lot of times you write these books and it tells you about all the different problems that you have. What I like about your book is at the end of the book, you have an itemized list of solutions that we have to work towards if we want to maintain our democracy. But before we get there, I'd like to ask about how do we handle the mindset of people? Because that animals, which we are inherently democratic, but that we have allowed an autocratic streak because of being ill-informed and brainwashed. Mm-hmm. I guess animals don't get brainwashed because they don't have our intellect. How can we mitigate that, in your opinion? Because that is my task, your task, and the task of many doing this kind of work.
Well, and that was the founding generation's task, too. I mean, Jefferson repeatedly wrote, I do not trust the rich to protect this nation. I mean, he said that a half a dozen different ways at different times. And not only him, I mean, multiple founders trash talked the morbidly rich of their time. It's a real challenge. I mean, we've seen Jefferson identified three groups that were oppressive in the history of Europe, and that was warlords, people who conquered by force of violence, theocrats, popes typically, and the morbidly rich, the lords, the barons, and their goal in creating this document was to have the power derived, as the Declaration says, derived from the consent of the governed. And so with all of my solutions in the end of the book, they're all put in the context of, if the goal of American democracy, of our American republic, is to have something close to a democracy, the essence of a democracy is that what the majority of people want is what they get. And so if you look at, I mean, I don't think there's a single thing in my solutions chapter that doesn't poll well over 50%. And yet we don't have them for this reason that you just identified, which is we've been conquered. We've been conquered by the morbidly rich. And it really started in 1971. I mean, it has happened a couple of times in our history. The morbidly rich rose up in the 1830s. I think you and I talked about this when my book about American oligarchy came out.
Right.
The cotton gin and how that contributed to fewer than 2,000 families ending up completely controlling all the politics and economics of the South. And, we fought a civil war over that. Then you had the rise of the robber barons again in the 1880s, 1890s. And then there was, Teddy Roosevelt and the trust buster going after them. And then you had the morbidly rich rising again in the 1920s and leading to the Republican Great Depression. And then Franklin Roosevelt went after them. So by 71, the rich people had by and large excluded themselves from politics. and that's when Lewis Powell came along and said, if rich people and corporations don't get involved in politics, we're going to find ourselves on the outside looking in, because Ralph Nader is really popular and he's a communist, essentially. And he called him out. He calls out Ralph Nader in the Powell memo. That was in 71. In 72, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. In 76, he voted on the Buckley decision, which said that bribing politicians shall no longer be called bribery because money is not money, it's speech, right? And in 78, he actually wrote the decision in the Buckley versus First National Bank, or the Bellotti versus First National Bank decision, or First National Bank versus Frank Bellotti, in which he said that not only is money free speech, but that corporations are persons and they're entitled to use free speech this way.
That was a killer. Oh, yeah.
And it was, and that the result of that was just a tsunami of mostly oil industry money flowing into the Republican Party and floating Ronald Reagan into the White House, as in reaction to Jimmy Carter creating a solar bank that would have had 20% of the nation's electricity being generated by the year 2000. Carter put that into place in 79, I think it was. And
he actually put the panels on the roof of the White House that Reagan summarily removed as soon as he got there.
That's right. That's right. And so, this was the beginning. There's another kind of backstory to it that I don't think is in this book. I think it's in my book on oligarchy. But in 1951, Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, in which he argued that the American middle class was growing very rapidly. It was closing in on 50% of Americans at that time in 1951. It was in the mid 40s. And he said, if it ever reaches, there's some kind of a threshold here, probably well over 50%, where if the American middle class reaches that threshold, it will throw America into social chaos, because people who have never had money don't know how to handle money. People who have never had political power don't know how to handle political power. This is essentially the same argument that the Dixiecrats made about giving political power to Black people in the South, that it would be a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And Kirk was considered a crackpot by most Republicans in 1951 when he published this book. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater thought he was a genius, but that was about it. But then came the 60s. In 61, the birth control pill was legalized, and within 3 years was widespread. And boom, you had the women's movement. You had the civil rights movement was growing like a weed in the 60s. In 64, you got the Civil Rights Act, 65, the Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King and all of the various parts of the Black movement, the civil rights movement, and then you also had the war in Vietnam, and you had young men saying, "Hell no, I'm not going to go," which was exactly what Russell Kirk had predicted: that women would no longer know their place, that minorities would no longer know their place, and that even the children of the white upper class would start to rebel. And that's literally what happened in the 60s, what he predicted in 1951. Now, it didn't happen for the reasons that he predicted, that there was too big a class. It happened for exogenous reasons, other external reasons, like the development of the birth control pill. But it happened, and so in the 70s, that's why Lewis Powell wrote the Powell Memo, and that's why the mandate that Reagan had when he came into office in 1981 was to cut the middle class down to size. And when he came into office, the middle class was 2/3 of us. 1/3 of America had a good union job, which set the wage and benefit floor locally, so that 2/3 of Americans had the equivalent of a good union job and had a middle class where one wage earner could buy a home, buy a new car every 2 years, take a vacation every year, and have enough money left over for retirement and to put their kids through school. That was my family. That was my dad. He worked in a tool and die shop, and that was the life he had. Although he didn't put me through school, but that was the middle class. So Reagan set out to destroy the middle class to save America. And these guys really believed that they were saving America.
You know what, Tom? I think you give them a lot of credit. I wonder if they really want to save America. As one of the things that I say, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, because my contention is that they don't want a strong middle class. They don't want an educated people, because an educated people would ask about our economic system. Why would we work so hard for so little to ensure that so many get so much? In effect, they are all on our backs.
Yeah, that's the essence of the union movement. And that's what built the American middle class. And that's why when Reagan set out to destroy the middle class, the first thing he attacked was the union movement. And we went from a third of Americans being unionized when he came into office to, by the time the Reagan-Bush 12 years was over, down to around 10%. I think we're around 6 or 8% in the private workforce now in the union movement. Crazy. So I think your analysis is right, but I don't think that they were sitting around saying, people will start questioning, like having Marxist analysis, economic analysis of power. No, they just didn't want people to have unions. They didn't want to have to pay people well. It was much simpler than that. But, a lot of among the theoreticians, the Buckleys and the Goldwaters, I really, having read their work and having, been steeped in their work when I was a kid, I really believe that they thought they were doing the best thing. I don't think that by the end of his term, Reagan thought he was doing the right thing, or the people around him. I think they just thought they were dancing to the tune of the really rich.
Wait,
who now own.
Wait. Are you saying you thought Reagan didn't think he was doing a bad thing? You think Reagan really thought he was saving the country?
I think he thought that at the beginning. I don't think, by the end, he was full-blown dementia, so who knows? But
yeah, right,
I don't think George Herbert Walker Bush thought that. I think he thought he was making America safe for aristocracy because he was a member of the aristocratic class. His grandfather was the senator and the wealthy banker and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Anyhow, we don't have a lot of time here. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Thom, is if you can, you have a whole lot of solutions. And I think that's what this is all about, guys, the solutions that are here in the book. Why don't you give me your 3 tops?
Well, again, these are things that the majority of Americans want. And the only reason we don't have them is because the Supreme Court has legalized political bribery. So, I'd say to begin with, everybody in America should have health care. It should be part of the commons, and it should be administered by the government, or at least paid for by the government, single payer like Canada does. And it would cost half as much. And you wouldn't have, people like Dollar Bill McGuire, the guy who started, United Healthcare, who walked away with $1.4 billion. That's obscene. Every penny of that was taken from somebody, from saying to somebody, no, we won't pay for your liver transplant.
Exactly.
So number 1, healthcare. Number 2, education. What we learned from the GI Bill, which my dad went to college on. He only went for 2 years. My wife's dad went all the way through law school and ended up the assistant attorney general for the state of Michigan. And he came from a dirt poor, like literally no running water family, is that the education is an investment. What we learned from the GI Bill was that for every dollar that the federal government invested in educating young people coming back from World War II, mostly young men, but nonetheless young people, was that we got $7 of return on investment in additional tax revenue, because educated people earn more and they stimulate the economy. And, there is no way that education's an expense. It's an investment. And that's why we are literally the only country on earth, or developed country on earth, where there's a student debt crisis. Every other country subsidizes higher education, like we did until 1980, or until the 1980s. Reagan ended free college in California as governor in the 70s, and then when he came into the White House, he cut. One of his first cuts was a 25% across the board cut to federal education support, and that began the gutting of the American public education system. So number 2 would be public education. I'd say number 3, and it's a very vital one, is establishing an absolute right to vote, so that Republican governors can no longer purge you from the voting rolls. They can no longer make you stand in line for 12 hours. They can no longer make you jump through 16 different hoops. You automatically get registered as soon as you turn 18, like in every other democratic country in the world. We have these bizarre systems that are purely the result of rich people having been given the power to own politicians by a corrupt Supreme Court. So those are my top 3.
The name of the book, the Hidden History of American Democracy. Read this, and I love the subtitle: Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Rediscovering American Ancient Way of Living. From the New York Times bestselling author, Thom Hartmann. Thank you so kindly once again, Thom. I revere your work. Thank you so kindly for being once again on Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much, Egberto, for inviting me. It's so nice talking with you. I appreciate it.
we spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please. Once a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an advertising agency founder, and author, William Dove Anderson has managed to craft a best-selling novel that encapsulates the points of view of all races. His thought, provoking and candid discussion of our racial divide in an extraordinarily balanced tone allows for others to launch into meaningful dialogue. Civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, slavery, critical race theory, affirmative action. Just mentioning any of those things could spark a debate, a fight, or even a riot in today's sensitive, divided society. Our nation still struggles with how to view or discuss matters of race. Does anyone really listen to a viewpoint other than their own? A new book explores, through a creative novel, The Price of Perfect, a way to launch our country into a peaceful and honest dialogue on race and racism. Senor Anderson, how are you doing today? And welcome to Politics and Right.
Thank you, Egbert. So good to be here with you.
Well, look, first of all, I'm going to ask you the question I always ask whenever I interview somebody who's written any book. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because I'm concerned about our country. As so many people are, as you just indicated, the difficulty that we're having in coming to terms with this age-old, centuries-old issue of race. And as a writer, I try to delve into something a little bit further than just the surface part. But King, I want to explore this whole issue of why can't we come together more than we do? And we're coming together a little bit better than I think we have. But what is this whole issue of race? Why is it such a difficult thing to do? And it started, to me, in part, with communications. As you indicated earlier, we just don't communicate about this subject. It's one of those hot button subjects. In fact, I was told by an editor who I let read the first draft, she said, "I'm warning you, don't write this book. Don't write about race because people are so upset about it, it could just blow up in your face." And I said, well, if nobody ever writes about it, frankly, how will it ever get truly resolved? And she also said, you're a white guy. You're trying to do a balanced book. How are you going to do a balanced book when half the book is about the pains, the travails, the terrible things blacks have been through? You don't know that. You could never know it. I said, well, you could say that about any writer. If they never live the subject they write about, they can never write about it. But I said, I'm going to take you up on that. I'm going to research this thing more than I had planned on doing it. So I spent the next couple of years off and on really reading a lot of Black literature, talking to a lot of folks I didn't know well of both races, and trying to learn as best I could as someone who could never live that life, never been a minority. I don't know what that feels like, could never know it. But trying to get into, as a writer, get into the shoes of the race and walk it as best I could. So with that, I started realizing several things. One is, as you said, everybody's truth is true. That means that truths are lies and lies are truths, depending on where you sit. So if you're debating someone or trying to change someone's opinion, the first thing you got to do is know where they're coming from. If we don't live in proximity to one another, it's like a friend. You can have a best friend that you don't see for a year, and all of a sudden you forgot all about them. We have to be physically closer to people to hear their story. We have to be compassionate listeners. We've become critics and not critical thinkers. We'd rather just take the easy way out is to categorize. In case I live in Atlanta, You turn on the evening news, it's generally a string of young black men who've committed crimes. If that's the only way white people know a black race, then they start to categorize, well, all young black guys are that way. The same is true for bad policemen beating up and killing young black men. You think, oh, well, all the police are that way. Let's defund all of them. It is a human characteristic and unfortunately weakness to categorize. It just makes it easier. Oh, I don't have to think about that. It's already in a category. The first thing we got to do is realize we're thinking very narrow. We're not really exploring this issue of what's it like to, where's the other race coming from? And to me, to do that, you need to talk. You need to meet people. Ask them the questions. The challenge today is to be frank. I tried to write a book where the main characters are strident in both their beliefs. How do these two knuckleheads come together when they can't agree on anything? That's the price we pay for being perfect, which is where the title came from.
Let me tell you something. Okay, first of all, I don't buy into the premise that we cannot be very empathetic, irrespective of our life values and struggles, because everybody at some time have gone through some negative. Yes, people. I can't. If I buy into that, I cannot see through the eyes of my wife. If I buy into that, I cannot see through the eyes of my daughter that women have been at a disadvantage throughout this country. I can see that. I can feel it. I can understand the pain that they feel when they go into a boardroom, and just knowing that they're female, that puts a scar, some sort of a stigma on them. I can understand that. So the first thing I want to say is I generally don't buy the premise that you can't be empathetic. I don't buy the premise that you can't be a white guy who understand black pain. I can say that one can become, what's the word that I want to use? One can become willfully ignorant to black pain. And that's why I admire you for having written the book and taking the pains. I mean, there are some black folks that are going to come to you and say, well, how the hell do you think you can speak about that? And I would say, well, because first of all, I understand pain. And also I have entertained speaking to everybody. So kudos for you on writing the book. I want to say one other thing before I ask you the next question, though. Earlier, you talk about being Southern, right? And I find, first of all, I like the South. I live in the South. I live in Texas, all right? I find that it's a fallacy to believe that this great heathenous South and racism are somewhat much different than what we find in the North. After all, in Boston, when we had the riots in Boston, it was, know, how different was that? I don't remember seeing that in the South, to tell you the truth. Okay. So it's all over the country. It's something that's systemic that we have to take care of. And I'm glad that you that you decided to write a book of this type. And I also think white guys hold an important key in solving the race problem, given that it is a white guy's problem. So your thoughts on that?
I think that because there's a sensitivity that I feel like Southerners have that others may not about the black situation, because it's been so much a part of our history and so much a negative part of our history. But you've got to, I felt empathetic toward the black cause, but until I really got into this and read books like Between the World and Me, read the book on trying to get reconciliation on Be the Bridge. So you read some of these books and really kind of reach out a little bit. As a writer, I had to do that because I was truly trying to represent a race that I'm not. Let me say the first problem we're having with communications is to use the word race. We're all the same dadgum race.
Thank you.
This whole thing is a construct that was created to show hierarchy. Oh, they're just that race, so that means they're all that way. They're this race. Blacks are not another race. Whites are not another race. We're all the same race. But unless you're truly, and the thing I was not prepared for is the brutality of the 300 or 400 years of slavery. You really get into what was done to a lot of black people. It was horrendous. It was terrible. 4,000 hanged over the period of time. My wife tried to get me to go to Montgomery where they said, you're studying this, let's go to that museum where they're honoring all those that were hanged. I said, I can't do it. I've become so sensitive to this issue. I can't go stand there and look at 4,000 people hanged, probably almost all of them illegally. But to be empathetic, we're all empathetic to a degree. But unless you really try to study the pain that somebody's gone through, you're just kind of skimming around on it. So I urge people to do their own research, see just white people. But also for the other side of the coin is we've got a one-way communication now. White people are afraid to really frankly discuss the Black issue because they'll be called a racist or insensitive or offensive. So there's got to be, we got to open both lines of communications so that whites can speak with some degree of frankness. And Blacks can say, well, that's something he'd say. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, but I'll accept it because he's trying to understand me a little bit better. So we've got to be some give and take here, back and forth of both of them. Yeah, the whites instigated this whole mess 400 years ago. But another theme of the book is just how much of the past do we keep reliving? At some point, you've got to honor the past, memorialize the past, but at some point, you just keep leaning on it, or you become a victim of the past. And I've had Black friends say, don't call me a victim. I resent you saying that. I said, well, you got to be careful because the problem with it is you're never accountable if you're a victim. It's always somebody else's fault. But again, those kind of frank back and forth, understanding that he may say something I'm not going to like, but I'm not going to jump him because they know he's trying to understand my side of it. And whites will say, well, Blacks have never had it better than you got it right now. All the corporations want to hire you. All the schools want you in their schools. You're making a lot of progress. So I don't understand. I've heard so many white people say this. Where are all the Black people committing crimes? Every time I turn on the news, they're Black people. The media is a major component in this whole issue as we try to line up eyeballs and butts in the chair to view our stations. And it's a money thing. We're all kind of becoming victimized by businesses trying to make money by playing to the opinion that they know people are going to watch that opinion. And all they're doing is cementing the categorization. They've already got people in.
You know, let me tell you something, William, because this I think you hit an important number when you talk about the media and how the media has actually corrupted the views of many people, specifically white people, on who Black folks really are. And I think it's important for somebody like you to go out there and say that. After all, you are a former journalist as well. And, I had a friend who once got in trouble, never been in trouble in his life. He got in trouble. And when he went he got a deal where he got some sort of probation for something that he did. And when he went into the room where all the people on probations were going to set up for that day, he was one of the few Black folks in there. It was filled with white people all on probation. And these are the folks that you see doing the same thing that get coverage for Black folks on TV, but white folks never see that. What I tell people all of the times is, and by the way, I love your point of view because that is what I preach on Politics Done Right. And that is, let's learn that we're all manipulated by a system that was created for manipulation in such a manner that we create dissension among people. And that's how, as you mentioned earlier, you're able to maintain an unfair hierarchical system that is not based on a meritocracy, but mostly based on a few.
Yeah. It's not based on biology either. We've all got the same DNA.
Exactly.
It's just where we were born, the geography, the sunshine you got or didn't get. It's just basic evolutionary stuff that made us look differently because we were conforming to that environment.
Right.
So
it is a very important thought. Now, again, your book is not a real story. It's a story, however, that could be real. Tell us a little bit about it without telling too much so that folks will go out there and get that book.
It's about an Atlanta developer, of which we've got many, who's going to build a building of his dreams in Atlanta. The whole city is excited about it. He's a big contributor to Black causes and charities, so he's beloved by the Black community. A Black female television reporter feels like that racism is systemic, and she's looking for a way she can publicize it more. She finds out a Black man was hanged on this property the building is going to be built on, demands the builder redesign the building to preserve the tree. He says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to have a hanging tree in front of my building. She says, well, if you don't, you're a racist. The book then evolves around all the characters. The tree becomes a metaphor for America and how we are agreeing or disagreeing on this one subject. And it forces the reader to take sides. There's about 20 characters. Every character has to react to that tree and what's going on in different ways. It shows how we vary in our varying degrees, whether how hostile we are to change or not. In fact, I think you could say that we're all under two categories, the samers and the changers. So they kind of pick sides in this book, and hopefully it's a balanced story of where we are today and the consequences of what happens when nobody will move. Everybody's truth is the truth. And I don't care about what yours is.
Well, I mean, it is important that we actually, that we actually get to the real truth. And I think when we get there, we're going to realize that we were just being puppeteered by a few, and that a lot of the dissension that we have among ourselves was by the design from the inception of this country. However, what I'd like to ask you, because I understand that you do a whole lot of this kind of work in Atlanta. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was blessed to be on the Atlanta Homeless Children's Shelter Board, where we helped create the first curriculum for homeless children, I think, in the country. Also co-founded a scholarship called the Good Samaritan Scholarship for Black, basically inner city seniors who have risen out of poverty. We're trying to show that you can rise out of the worst circumstances you can imagine. No daddy, no parents, no money, no nothing. And yet they rise to be splendid performers. So I've tried to be an encourager. I've been on a number of boards, all directed toward basically the inner city community. Even PTA president of basically a minority high school. But I'm basically a writer, and I've been creative director for 4 ad agencies I started. So I've been in the communications business and have a little bit of understanding of how it works. And how it's failing miserably today. But your kind of show is one of the answers for coming out of this situation. It really is. It's a blessing to have someone who's really onto this and has got a good feel for the issues involved in this thing and the complexity of it. It's incredibly complex issues on the one hand. On the other hand, it's simple as dirt. Just love and respect people. Take them for who they are and don't put them in some category and just kiss them off. Well, that's who they are. I saw them on the evening news, or I saw that white guy passing another law that says they're going to run a highway through my community. So all those guys are bad. We're generalizing too blasted much. I've had a Black friend tell me on the front end that you got to know we're all not alike. White people think all Black people think we're alike because we like to vote Democrat right now, but we're as different as you are. So don't be generalizing about everything. So it becomes a big communications issue that can be resolved if people would just open their mind, take the time, read some books, learn about each other, talk to each other, but also get some leadership that will address these issues in a more forthcoming way. Don't just do it to try to get more money for this group and more money for that group.
Well, let me tell you something. It's been my pleasure, William, to speak to you. It is great to see somebody like yourself out of the journalism field, out of the philanthropic field, and actually not trying to be some white savior, but somebody who brings understanding on the issues and is also very, very frank in wanting to approach it in a manner in which you're doing, including with the book that you've written. So I want to ask you what I ask everybody that's on my program as the last question. What would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't?
I'd like for you to ask me what I'm going to do next with this.
So what are you going to do next?
It's one thing to talk the talk. You got to walk the walk. I want to reach out more. In fact, I'm trying it right now to reach out to 4 people that live in this area, Black people, and gain an understanding of how we can join up better. How can we come together better? And a lot of it's going to be through churches. I'm a big advocate of that's one remaining common denominator both so-called races do have. So I want to not just preach, but I want to go out and do what I've been talking about in this book that needs to be done and not be perfect. We're all very imperfect.
William Anderson, author of The Price of Perfect. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thank you, Egbert, so much. Enjoy being here.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number 1, subscribe to our channel, and number 2, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.